The sound of splintering would rip through the air like a gunshot. David Miller jolted awake, his heart slamming against his ribs as the distant hum of an engine turned into a deafening roar. His gut told him something was wrong before his eyes even focused. He threw open the bedroom window, and his stomach twisted into a knot. A massive yellow bulldozer was grinding over the shore, its steel blade carving through it like a knife through butter. His dock, his sanctuary, his late father's fishing chair gone. David didn't even stop to put on proper shoes. He sprinted out the front door, still in his pajama pants, his breath coming in sharp bursts as he charged toward the destruction. The workers didn't even flinch. They acted like he wasn't even there. He stumbled over broken planks, his bare feet scraping against jagged edges, but he barely felt the pain. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice cracked with rage as he skidded to a halt in front of the machine. The operator, a middle-aged man in an orange vest, didn't even turn his head. "Just following orders, sir." "Orders?" David's fists clenched as he scanned the area. That's when he saw her, Eleanor Vance, standing a few feet away with her arms crossed, her manicured nails gleaming in the morning sun. Her expression was the perfect blend of amusement and indifference, like she was watching a minor inconvenience rather than the destruction of something that had been in his family for decades. "Eleanor." David stormed toward her, pointing at the wreckage. "You better have a damn good explanation for this." She smiled, not the friendly kind, the kind that made his blood pressure skyrocket. This dock was in violation of HOA Code 37B. She tilted her head in mock sympathy. "We sent you multiple warnings." David let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "You mean those notes you shoved under my door last night? Real generous of you to give me a full 12 hours before bringing in the wrecking crew." Eleanor shrugged. "Rules are rules, Mr. Miller." A loud snap echoed behind him. He turned just in time to see his father's old fishing chair get crushed beneath the bulldozer treads. The wood crumbled like dust. Something inside him cracked. His father had built that chair with his own hands, spending hours on that dock teaching David how to fish, how to be patient, how to appreciate the stillness of the water. And now all of it, every memory, every connection to his dad, was being wiped out in front of his eyes. A wave of fury rolled through him. "This isn't about a stupid HOA rule, is it?" Eleanor's smile widened. "You're a difficult resident, David. You don't attend our meetings, you ignore our landscaping guidelines, and quite frankly, you don't belong in this community." There it was. The real reason. She didn't like that David refused to bow to her ridiculous rules, that he didn't fall in line like the rest of the neighborhood. David took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm, to not give her the satisfaction of seeing him snap. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice dangerously even. Eleanor raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Oh, and what exactly are you going to do?" David smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "You'll see." She laughed, actually laughed, as if he were some joke. "Good luck with that. Your dock is gone, David. You're not getting it back." He didn't say another word. He turned and walked away, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles went white. He could feel the stares of the other HOA board members, their smug little grins, their whispers. They thought they'd won. They thought he was just some average guy who would take the hit and disappear. They had no idea who they were messing with. David Miller wasn't just some guy. He was the governor's brother, and he was about to make their lives a living hell. He stormed back into his house, slamming the door behind him, his mind already racing through the possibilities. He could call his brother, sure. Robert Miller had enough pull to wipe out this HOA with a single phone call. But that would be too easy, too clean. No, David wanted something better. He wanted to watch Eleanor squirm, to see the smugness drain from her face when she realized she had messed with the wrong person. He grabbed his laptop and started digging. If there was one thing he knew about HOA presidents like Eleanor, it was that they thrived on power and control. And where there was power, there was corruption. It didn't take long to find the first red flag. The HOA's financial records were a mess. Misfiled invoices, misplaced fines, unexplained transactions that conveniently benefited Eleanor and her closest allies. He found receipts for extravagant vacations, spa trips, and designer handbags, all under the guise of community maintenance. Bingo. He leaned back in his chair, a slow grin spreading across his face. This was just the beginning. But he needed more proof, more people who had been wronged by the HOA's ridiculous fines and restrictions. As if on cue, his phone buzzed. It was his neighbor, Mr. Henderson, The guy who had been fined $1,000 for having a mailbox that was the wrong shade of beige. "I saw what they did to your doc, kid," the old man said, his voice gruff. "I think it's time we fight back." David exhaled, a surge of determination flooding through him. Damn right it is. The war had just begun. David sat at his kitchen table, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he pulled up every HOA record he could get his hands on. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed. The rage from earlier had settled into something sharper, something colder. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was focused, the kind of focus that had won him fights in the past, the kind that made people nervous when they saw it in his eyes. The HOA wasn't just some petty neighborhood committee with a superiority complex. No, this was something deeper, something rotten. The more he dug, the worse it got. At first, it was little things. Overcharged HOA fees, unexplained expenses, payments listed under vague terms like community improvement that had no documentation to back them up. Then he found a real gold mine. Eleanor Vance had been running the HOA like her personal piggy bank for years. Thousands of dollars funneled into accounts that didn't belong to the association, invoices from fake vendors, even checks made out directly to her under the guise of administrative bonuses. David let out a low whistle as he leaned back in his chair. This wasn't just corruption, this was fraud. He glanced at the clock. It was past midnight, but he knew he wouldn't be sleeping anytime soon. Instead, he grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the one person who could help him blow this whole thing wide open. Sarah Chun, investigative journalist, professional thorn in the side of every corrupt official she had ever crossed paths with. They had gone to college together, and while David had chosen a quieter life, Sarah had made a career out of exposing people like Eleanor. He hit the call button. It rang twice before she picked up. "David Miller," she said, her voice groggy but instantly intrigued. "Why do I have a feeling this isn't a social call?" David grinned. "Because you know me too well." "Uh-huh. And what exactly have you gotten yourself into this time?" He hesitated for half a second, then said, "How do you feel about taking down a corrupt HOA president?" There was a pause. Then, "Tell me everything." David laid it out for her. The fines, the bulldozing, the fraudulent financial records, every detail, every piece of evidence he had gathered so far. He could hear her shifting in bed, probably grabbing a notepad. "This is good," she said when he finished. "Really good. But we need more." "I know," David said. "And I have a feeling I know exactly where to get it." The next morning, David found himself standing outside Mr. Henderson's house, hands shoved into his pockets as he waited for the door to open. It swung wide, and the old man squinted at him before stepping aside. "Took you long enough," Mr. Henderson muttered, motioning for David to follow him inside. The living room looked exactly like David remembered it, wood-paneled walls, a recliner that had seen better days, and a TV that was permanently tuned to the news. But what caught his attention was the stack of papers on the coffee table. Mr. Henderson sat down with a grunt and motioned to them. "Everything you're looking for is in there," he said. "I've been keeping track for years. Thought about going public once, but figured no one would listen to some grumpy old man." David flipped through the papers, his jaw tightening with every page. This was it. There were signed statements from homeowners who had been fined for nonsense violations. Kids leaving bikes in driveways, porch decorations that didn't fit the HOA's strict guidelines. Even one woman who had been forced to repaint her front door 3 times because Eleanor claimed the shade of blue wasn't community appropriate. Then there were the bigger things. Complaints about Eleanor using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, documents that proved she had been overcharging homeowners for maintenance that had never actually been done, emails from board members who had tried to challenge her only to be mysteriously voted out before they could push for an audit. David let out a low breath. This wasn't just fraud. It was an entire system of abuse. He looked up at Mr. Henderson. "Why didn't you do anything with this before?" The old man gave him a tired smile. "Because she had the board in her pocket, and anyone who fought back got buried in fines until they either paid up or left." David nodded slowly. He had no doubt Eleanor would have done the same to him if she had known who he really was. But she had underestimated him, and that was going to be her biggest mistake. He grabbed his phone and called Sarah. "I've got what you need," he said the moment she answered. There was a brief silence. Then, "Meet me in an hour." An hour later, they were sitting in a diner, a thick folder spread out between them. Sarah flipped through the pages, her eyes narrowing. "This is bad," she murmured. "Like prison time bad." David smirked. "That's the idea." She looked up at him. We can go public with this, but we need a final nail in the coffin. Something undeniable. Something that will force the board to turn on her. David thought for a moment, then slowly he smiled. I think I know exactly how to get it. That night, he attended his first HOA meeting in years. Eleanor was already there, standing at the front of the room with her usual smug expression, flanked by board members who looked more like hostages than willing participants. The room was packed. Homeowners, neighbors, people who had all felt the weight of her ridiculous rules. David waited until the meeting was in full swing before he stood up. I have a question, he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. Eleanor's smile faltered just slightly. This isn't the time for questions, Mr. Miller. David shrugged. I just wanted to know if you could explain these. He stepped forward and placed the folder on the table in front of her. The room fell silent. Eleanor hesitated, then flipped open the top page. Her face paled. David leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear. I wonder what would happen if the governor saw these. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. For the first time, she looked rattled. David smiled. Checkmate. Eleanor's fingers twitched as she flipped through the stack of papers, her face frozen in that artificial smile she always wore when she wanted to intimidate someone. But this time, it wasn't working. The room had gone completely silent, all eyes locked on her as she stared down at undeniable proof of her corruption. David could practically hear her mind scrambling for a way out, a way to twist this in her favor. She wasn't the type to admit defeat. She was the type to double down. She lifted her head, clearing her throat before speaking. These are blatant forgeries, she said, her voice just a little too controlled. You think a couple of doctored documents will scare me? This is nothing but a desperate attempt to smear my reputation. David smirked, watching the cracks in her composure spread. Oh, I figured you'd say that, he said casually, pulling out his phone. Which is why I made sure to get something a little more undeniable. He tapped the screen and hit play. The sound of Eleanor's own voice filled the room, cold and condescending. I don't care if they can't afford the fines. If they want to live here, they'll pay. And if they can't, they can leave. More properties for us to resell at a premium. Eleanor's face turned a shade paler. The recording continued, detailing how she manipulated HOA fees, funneled money into her personal accounts, and pressured board members into silence. The murmurs in the room grew louder, shifting from confusion to outright anger. People who had once been too afraid to speak up were now whispering to each other, realizing just how deep this corruption ran. A man near the back stood up, his voice trembling with fury. So that's why my fines kept doubling. You were just trying to force me out. Another woman shot to her feet. You made me repaint my house twice because you didn't like the color. You made me spend thousands of dollars just because you could. More voices joined in, the tension rising like a storm about to break. Eleanor slammed her hands on the table. This meeting is over, she snapped, her voice tight with panic. Everyone go home. No one moved. David crossed his arms. Looks like no one's listening to you anymore, Eleanor. She shot him a glare sharp enough to cut steel. I will have you thrown out of this community, Miller. David chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, I don't think you will. In fact, I think you're the one who's about to be thrown out. Eleanor turned to the board members, her last hope at regaining control. But the men and women who once backed her unconditionally now looked hesitant, even afraid. One of them, a man named Richard, cleared his throat. Eleanor, this is serious. We need to discuss this. Eleanor's expression twisted with disbelief. You're taking his side? After everything I've done for this community? Richard shifted uncomfortably. We can't ignore this. If these accusations are true, we're all at risk. Eleanor scoffed. Accusations? This is nothing but a smear campaign. I built this community. I made it what it is today. David leaned against the table, amused by how quickly her arrogance was crumbling. No, Eleanor. You built a kingdom for yourself while everyone else suffered. And now that kingdom is burning. Eleanor's breath was coming in short, sharp bursts. She had always been untouchable, always been the one holding the power. But now the power was slipping from her fingers, and she had no idea how to stop it. Then, in a last desperate attempt, she straightened her back and turned to David with a chilling smile. You think you've won? You have no idea what I'm capable of. David didn't flinch. Neither do you. For the first time, real fear flickered in her eyes. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the meeting hall. David watched her go, knowing full well that she wasn't done fighting. Eleanor wasn't the type to go down without a war. And if she couldn't hold on to her power the legal way, she'd try something much worse. That night, David barely made it into his house before his phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "You need to be careful," she said, skipping right past pleasantries. "Eleanor is already trying to spin this. I have sources telling me she's reaching out to people, trying to push the blame onto the board. She's calling you a liar, saying you doctored the audio." David wasn't surprised. "Let her try? The evidence is solid. She's desperate, David, and desperate people do stupid things." He exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. He knew Sarah was right. Eleanor wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat. She would fight until her last breath, and if he wasn't careful, she'd find a way to turn the tables. The next morning, his suspicions were confirmed. David walked outside to find a tow truck parked in his driveway, its driver attaching a chain to his truck. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" David barked, marching toward the man. The driver barely looked at him. "Got an order from the HOA. Non-compliance violation." David clenched his jaw. Non-compliance of what? The driver handed him a notice. It was a list of fabricated violations: unregistered vehicle, improper parking, failure to maintain property appearance. David's grip tightened around the paper. This was Eleanor's doing, her last-ditch effort to make his life miserable. The driver gave him an apologetic shrug. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. I'm just following orders." David took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. "Governor Miller speaking." David smirked. "Hey bro, how do you feel about taking down an HOA?" There was a pause, then, "What did they do?" David chuckled, watching as the tow truck driver's expression shifted from bored indifference to outright panic. "Oh, just some small-town corruption. But don't worry, I've got it handled." The driver hurriedly unhooked the truck without another word and drove off. David watched him go, shaking his head. Eleanor was playing checkers while he was playing chess. She wanted a war. She was about to lose one. David knew Eleanor wouldn't go down without a fight, but he had underestimated just how petty she could be. The next morning, he woke up to find a bright red notice taped to his front door. He yanked it off and scanned the text, already knowing it was another one of her desperate moves. Apparently, he had been fined $10,000 for violating community landscaping regulations. His crime? Letting his grass grow half an inch too tall. He laughed, a deep, incredulous laugh. She really thought this was going to break him? She thought he'd roll over because of a ridiculous fine? She was grasping at straws, and that meant she was scared. Good. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. "Sarah, you're on the news," she said the moment he answered. David blinked. "Excuse me." "Eleanor went to the press," Sarah said, her tone laced with frustration. "She's claiming that you're harassing her, spreading lies, and trying to incite violence against the HOA. She's playing the victim card hard." David ran a hand down his face. "You've got to be kidding me. Not even a little." She held a press conference. She was practically crying. It was some Oscar-worthy acting. David sighed. He should have expected this. Eleanor wasn't just a dictator. She was a manipulator. She knew how to twist the narrative to make herself look like the innocent party. He had seen it before. People like her never took accountability. They just played the victim until everyone else got tired of fighting. Too bad for her. David wasn't the kind to get tired. He grabbed his keys and headed out the door. If Eleanor wanted a battle in the public eye, he was more than happy to oblige. By the time he arrived at the community center, it was packed. The HOA meeting was supposed to be a routine check-in, but thanks to the recent chaos, half the neighborhood had shown up. There were news cameras, reporters, and homeowners whispering amongst themselves. Some people looked angry, others looked worried. Eleanor was standing at the front of the room, dressed in her usual power suit, smiling like she hadn't just tried to destroy his life. David took his seat near the back, arms crossed as he watched her work the crowd. "I know things have been tense lately," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "There have been accusations, misinformation, and frankly, a lot of unnecessary hostility." A few people nodded. She was good. David had to give her that. "But I want to assure you," Eleanor continued, placing a hand over her heart, "everything I've done has been for the betterment of this community. I have always had your best interests at heart." David almost choked on his own laughter. A man in the front row stood up. "Then what about the fines? My wife and I were charged $3,000 for having a bird feeder." Eleanor sighed, shaking her head like a disappointed mother. "We have to maintain standards. The HOA rules exist to protect property values." Another voice chimed in. What about the time you made the Jeffersons repaint their house 3 times because you didn't like the shade of blue? That was a misunderstanding, Eleanor said quickly. David watched, amused, as the crowd slowly started to turn against her. Then he stood up. Eleanor, how much of the HOA funds have you spent on your personal expenses? The room went silent. Eleanor's smile faltered. Excuse me. David pulled out his phone. Would you like me to list them? The spa treatments, the first-class flights, the personal chef you paid for with HOA money. Eleanor's face went pale. That's a baseless accusation. Oh, is it? David tapped his phone. Because I have receipts. I have emails. I have bank statements. And if you'd like, I can forward them all to every single person in this room right now. A murmur ran through the crowd. Eleanor clenched her jaw. This meeting is over. She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, another board member stood up. Richard, the same man who had hesitated at the last meeting. No, he said, his voice shaking but firm. It's not over. Eleanor turned slowly, eyes narrowed. What did you say? Richard swallowed hard. I said it's not over. We need to address this. The murmur grew louder. More board members were nodding. More homeowners were whispering. The tide was shifting. David took a step forward. The truth is out, Eleanor. You've been robbing these people for years. You used the HOA to fund your own lifestyle while making everyone else miserable. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. I will sue you for slander. David smirked. Please do. I'd love to see this go to court. That was the final nail in the coffin. Eleanor's eyes darted around the room, but she could see it as clearly as David could. She had lost. The community wasn't on her side anymore. The board wasn't on her side. And now the cameras were rolling, capturing every second of her downfall. She turned on her heel and stormed out, shoving past reporters who bombarded her with questions. David let out a slow breath. It was over, or so he thought. Later that night, as he sat on his newly rebuilt dock, his phone buzzed again. It was Sarah. You need to see this, she said. She sent him a link. David clicked it. It was a news article. HOA president under investigation for fraud. His lips curled into a grin. He had won. But as he leaned back in his chair, watching the stars reflect off the water, he had a feeling Eleanor wasn't done yet. People like her never knew when to quit. David woke up the next morning to the sound of his phone vibrating against his nightstand. He groggily reached for it, squinting at the screen. It was Sarah. He knew she wouldn't be calling this early unless it was important. He sat up, running a hand through his hair before answering. You're famous, Sarah said before he could even get a word in. David rubbed his eyes. What now? Eleanor's meltdown at the HOA meeting went viral. News stations are picking it up, and it's spreading like wildfire. David let out a slow breath. He had expected backlash, expected attention, but he hadn't expected it to happen this fast. She hasn't been arrested yet, has she? He asked, already knowing the answer. Not yet, Sarah said, but it's only a matter of time. The state's attorney general announced they're launching a full investigation. Apparently, she's been under suspicion for a while, but your little expose just fast-tracked things. David swung his legs over the side of the bed. He wasn't going to celebrate just yet. Eleanor had too many connections, too many people in her pocket. She was the kind of person who thrived on control, and when people like that started to lose, they got desperate. As if on cue, there was a loud knock at his front door. David glanced toward it, his instincts kicking in. Something didn't feel right. He set his phone down without hanging up and grabbed the baseball bat he kept by his nightstand, just in case. He opened the door. Standing there was a man in a suit, his expression unreadable. Behind him, parked at the curb, was a black sedan with tinted windows. David didn't recognize him, but he had a pretty good idea of who sent him. David Miller, the man asked, his voice smooth and professional. David leaned against the doorframe. Depends on who's asking. The man didn't smile. I represent some concerned parties who believe you might be making a mistake. David arched an eyebrow. Is that so? The man nodded. You've caused quite a stir, Mr. Miller. Some people feel that it would be in everyone's best interest if this all just went away. David exhaled slowly. You mean Eleanor? The man didn't confirm or deny it, which was confirmation enough. David smirked. And what exactly is she offering? A bribe? A threat? Let me guess. I back off, and she pretends none of this ever happened. The man straightened his tie. Something like that. You'd be surprised how quickly these kinds of problems disappear when the right arrangements are made. David chuckled, shaking his head. See, that's the problem. Eleanor spent her whole life making things disappear. Not this time. The man studied him for a moment before sighing. I was hoping you'd be reasonable. David tightened his grip on the bat. And I was hoping you'd take a hint and get off my porch. The man's jaw tensed, but he nodded. Have it your way. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. David watched as the sedan pulled away, disappearing down the street. He had dealt with people like this before, people who thought power made them untouchable. They always underestimated the wrong person. He picked his phone back up. Sarah was still on the line. Well, she said, that sounded interesting. David let out a breath. Eleanor's scared. Sarah hummed in agreement. Good. That afternoon, the news broke. The FBI had raided the HOA office. Eleanor had been taken in for questioning. The evidence David had provided was just the tip of the iceberg. Investigators had uncovered years of financial fraud, embezzlement, and even tax evasion. The headlines were brutal. HOA president arrested in major fraud scandal. Eleanor Vance taken into custody, faces multiple felony charges. David sat back, watching the coverage unfold on his TV. Cameras flashed as Eleanor was led out of the building in handcuffs, her face pale, her usual confidence completely gone. She tried to cover her face, but there was no escaping this. The reporters swarmed, shouting questions. Eleanor, do you have anything to say? Were you aware of the full extent of the fraud? Do you regret targeting residents with unfair fines? Eleanor didn't answer. She just kept walking, her heels clicking against the pavement as she was loaded into the back of a squad car. David shook his head. It was over. He could hear cheering outside. His neighbors, the same people Eleanor had spent years controlling, were celebrating. It wasn't just about her going to jail. It was about freedom. They were finally free from her ridiculous rules, her constant harassment, her greed. His phone buzzed again. It was his brother. You really did a number on this one, Governor Miller said with a chuckle. David smiled. You know me, always stirring up trouble. Well, I just got a call from the State Housing Commission. They want me to push new regulations on HOAs. Tighter oversight, stricter rules against abuse. Your little war might actually change the system. David blinked. He hadn't even thought about that. He just wanted Eleanor gone. But now his fight had started something bigger. His brother hesitated for a moment. They also want to know if you'd be interested in helping with the reforms, maybe even leading a committee. David laughed. Absolutely not. Governor Miller chuckled. Figured as much. Just thought I'd ask. David glanced out the window. The sun was setting over the lake, casting golden light over the water. I think I'll stick to fishing, he said. His brother sighed. All right, but if you ever change your mind, I won't. His brother laughed. Enjoy your peace then. David hung up, setting his phone aside. He grabbed a beer from the fridge and made his way to the dock, the same dock Eleanor had destroyed. It had taken some work, but the community had come together to rebuild it better than before. He sat down, letting his feet dangle over the edge. The water was calm, the kind of calm he hadn't felt in weeks. It was finally over. No more ridiculous fines, no more threats, no more HOA tyranny. As he took a sip of his beer, he heard a voice behind him. You know, Sarah said, stepping onto the dock. You could make a career out of this. David shook his head. Not a chance. She smirked. Well, at least tell me you're going to enjoy the victory. David looked out at the water, feeling the weight of the last few weeks finally lift off his shoulders. Oh, I plan to, he said. I plan to enjoy every second of it. And for the first time in a long time, he truly meant it. David sat on his newly rebuilt dock, the wood still fresh and firm beneath him, the scent of varnish faintly lingering in the air. The lake stretched out before him, calm and undisturbed, reflecting the soft glow of the evening sky. It had been a long time since he had been able to sit here in peace. No bulldozers, no HOA threats, no ridiculous fines, just the sound of water gently lapping against the shore, the occasional chirp of crickets, and the low hum of his neighbor's old radio, playing some forgotten country song in the distance. He exhaled, taking it all in. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't bracing for the next battle. He wasn't strategizing, planning, or anticipating the next move. It was done. Eleanor was facing serious jail time. The HOA was being investigated, and the neighborhood had come together in a way he never thought possible. People who had been too afraid to speak up were now standing together, making sure no one like Eleanor would ever take control again. It was a win, a real, solid win. His phone buzzed beside him. He glanced at it, seeing a message from Sarah. Sarah, you're a legend. HOA reform is trending nationwide. David smirked, shaking his head. He hadn't set out to start a movement, but it looked like that's exactly what had happened. People all over the country were sharing their own HOA horror stories, calling for stricter regulations, demanding accountability. News segments were dissecting Eleanor's downfall, using it as an example of what happened when power went unchecked. David had even gotten a call from a national news station asking if he'd be willing to do an interview. He had declined. He wasn't interested in fame. He just wanted his damn fishing dock back. The screen lit up again. Another message, this time from his brother. Governor Miller, you sure you don't want to be the face of HOA reform? You could make a real difference. David rolled his eyes and typed back a quick response. David, nope. I prefer peace and quiet. He set the phone down and grabbed a beer from the cooler beside him. He popped the cap off, taking a long sip as he let himself finally, truly relax. A voice interrupted his moment. So, what's next for the great David Miller? He turned to see Sarah walking toward him, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. She stepped onto the dock, looking out at the water as she plopped down beside him. David smirked. Fishing. She rolled her eyes. You know what I mean. He took another sip of his beer. I'm serious. No more HOA drama. No more Eleanor. No more nonsense. Just me, the lake, and some peace and quiet. Sarah leaned back on her elbows, watching the last slivers of sunlight fade beyond the horizon. You're going to get bored. David chuckled. That's the plan. She grinned. Well, at least you got some justice. And you made sure Eleanor got exactly what she deserved. David nodded. It was true. She had spent years making people's lives miserable, using her position to bully and steal, and in the end, she had lost everything. Her reputation, her power, her money. The HOA board had voted her out officially, though that was more of a formality at this point. With felony charges stacking up against her, she wouldn't be worrying about HOA meetings for a long time. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled for a moment before showing him the screen. It was a photo. Eleanor wearing a drab-looking polo shirt, standing at the entrance of a Walmart with a forced smile. David blinked. What the hell am I looking at? Sarah grinned. Eleanor's new job. David snorted. You're kidding. Nope. She's out on bail until her trial, and apparently her assets are frozen. So now she's got to work like the rest of us. David shook his head, taking the phone from her to get a closer look. He zoomed in, noticing the name tag clipped to her shirt. It read, Eleanor V., Customer Service. He nearly choked on his beer from laughing. You mean to tell me that the same woman who fined a guy for parking his truck 2 inches over the driveway line is now dealing with coupon disputes? Sarah grinned. Poetic justice, isn't it? David handed her phone back, shaking his head in amusement. He had been content with seeing Eleanor arrested, but this was better than he could have imagined. Sarah nudged him. You should go say hi. David raised an eyebrow. What? Drive down to Walmart just to rub it in? She shrugged. Why not? A little victory lap never hurt anyone. He considered it for a moment. It was petty, but after everything Eleanor had done, after the months of stress, fines, and threats, a little pettiness felt well-deserved. The next afternoon, David found himself standing in the checkout line at Walmart, holding nothing but a pack of fishing bait and a can of soda. He didn't need either, but he wasn't here to shop. He watched as Eleanor rang up customers, her face carefully blank, her movements stiff. She wasn't used to being on the other side of authority. She wasn't the one giving orders anymore. She was just another worker, answering to a boss, dealing with difficult customers, living paycheck to paycheck. When it was finally his turn in line, she looked up. The moment she recognized him, her face went completely rigid. David set his items down on the counter, offering her a slow smile. Hey there, Eleanor. Fancy seeing you here. She inhaled sharply through her nose, but said nothing. Her hands trembled slightly as she scanned the barcode on the bait. David leaned against the counter. How's the new job? Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. He continued. You know, I was thinking about getting back into fishing now that I don't have to worry about some power-hungry HOA president bulldozing my dock. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She dropped the items into a plastic bag and pushed them toward him without a word. David grinned, picking up the bag and tipping an imaginary hat. You have a great day now. He turned and walked away, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Back at home, he returned to his dock, cracked open another beer, and watched the sun start to set. Sarah had been right. He had won, and not just in a legal sense. He had won because he was free to live without fines, without threats, without someone trying to control every aspect of his home. He had gotten justice, not just for himself, but for everyone in the neighborhood. And best of all, he had his peace back. For the first time in a long time, David Miller had nothing to fight, nothing to prove. Just the water, the sky, and the promise of a quiet, peaceful life, exactly the way it was supposed to be.